What's going on, everyone? So welcome to my latest video. This is a video I've been wanting to do for several years, but to be honest with you, this is a difficult video to do. That is my top 10 favorite action films of all time. Yes, I have seen a wide range of action films, and there are a lot of action films, including ones that you can probably see in my Blu-ray collection and 4K collection, of course, that I love. But to have it where there's like at least 100 action films that I could put on this list and condense it down to 10 and 5 honorable mentions, that's a lot. So you might watch this video and you might say to yourself, wait a minute, there's certain entries that aren't on this list. It's just a simple matter of the fact that I probably really like the film, but it just wasn't able to get squeezed onto this list. So just keep that in mind and be sure to follow me on Letterboxd where you can see all the action films that I've seen. I do like this genre quite a bit, which is why I'm doing this video. And I am joined with another enthusiastic YouTube critic that loves the action genre as well. And that is Balaban of Film Toppings. If you have yet to subscribe to his channel on YouTube as well as on Letterboxd, be sure to do so because he is a really good guy. And I've collaborated with him many times in the past, specifically on his channel. So be sure to, give him some love, and especially on Letterboxd. He has some really funny reviews, very zany one-liners. So again, it's a lot of fun and a blast to have him on this channel. But the way this video is going to work is this. He's going to give his honorable mentions. I'll then give my honorable mentions. He'll give his 10 to 6. I'll give my 10 to 6. He'll give his 5 to 1. I'll give my 5 to 1. And then we'll wrap things up. But it goes without saying, but nonetheless, I have to say it, it seems on certain videos, this list is going to be subjective. Both Gal and I, we are going to have different lists from you, and that's what's great about film as an art form. It is subjective. So your list will be different, and I'm honestly very excited and curious to see what your list is going to look like in the comment section down below. So be sure to put your top 10 in said comment section down below. And guys, enough exposition. Gal? Take it away.
Hey Chad and all of Chad's viewers, I'm Gal here from Film Toppings, and I'm very excited to be joining you to count down our top 10 action movies of all time. This is a combination of action movies across all eras. Some of the most formative movies in my life are on here, and I decided to also try and diversify my list, so to include some franchise films, some non-franchise films, some old, some modern, to have this most exciting. So there are some films that could make my favorites of all time list, but I decided to leave off of here just to make sure I was including a variety of action movies that I adore and think are iconic and timeless. I do want to kick off our time together with some honorable mentions before I go to the 10 through 6. So some of the honorable mentions that almost made my list include some iconic classics like Die Hard, True Lies, and The Fugitive. I also thought I'd shout out some recent honorable mentions that I love: Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, John Wick Chapter 4, Top Gun Maverick, and Kingsman The Secret Service, all of which I considered putting on the list and just about missed it.
So for honorable mentions, I have 5, and to kick things off, let's go with the most recent entry on this list, and that is Furioso, a Mad Max saga. This is a prequel to Mad Max Fury Road, and I absolutely love this film. I know it legit just came out this year, but I saw this film twice in theaters, and then I actually got the Blu-ray out of my local library for the 3rd time because I was waiting for this bad boy steelbook to come in, and it finally did, and guess what? I haven't opened it yet, so you know what that means? I'm probably going to watch this a 4th time by the end of this year. I love this film. I think it is a great prequel, but at the same time, even if you haven't seen Mad Max Fury Road, it stands on its own, and that is what's probably the biggest compliment you can give a prequel. But also, the action in this film, it is one of those situations where it's not as frantic as like Fury Road, but when it does show up, it is incredible. There is an action scene about the midway point that is absolutely fantastic. Everything you want in an action film is just in this film. It has so many different variety of set action scenes that I couldn't want anything more. This is how action films should be filmed, and I absolutely love Furioso. It is incredible. It's a shame it didn't do well at the box office, but I do have a feeling that this will have a cult following down the line. So I love Furioso, and that's why it is an honorable mention. Next honorable mention we have, I own the whole Bourne series, but specifically we have, which one am I going to choose? You probably guessed it. The Bourne Ultimatum. Yeah, I love The Bourne Ultimatum. In my eyes, this is what ended the series. It was not 5 movies, even though I own all 5 movies on this 4K set. This was a great finale to the trilogy. It was incredible. I think that in terms of frenetic action with like shaky camera style, this is probably one of, if not the best elements of this film. And unfortunately for the action industry, This film in particular is what made it so that way other action films then tried to emulate it. But they didn't really understand that it's not just shaky camera work that makes it so incredible. It's also the fact that you feel the visceral nature of it. If you can't tell what's going on completely, then you're not going to care. But because you care about the characters, because you can actually have some semblance of what's going on, it's just an amazing experience. I love The Bourne Ultimatum. It is one of my favorite Paul Greengrass's films. And yeah, just an overall great action film. And that's why I have it as an honorable mention. And actually, for the longest time, probably about a decade ago, it might have been my favorite action film or top 3. But, you know, times have changed. But yeah, that's an honorable mention. Next up, we have Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Love this film. It is one of my favorite films of the 2000s. And the action here is something that when I first saw it as a teenager, I didn't appreciate this film. In fact, I hated this film. But I rewatched it back in 2019, and I immediately saw that this is a film that is gorgeous. But not only is it gorgeous, the action sequences feel so unique because it's wire-fi. And I understand that many people look at The Matrix as the film where it's like, oh my goodness, it's incredible with what they're doing with the wire work. This is the film, though, that I usually think about in terms of that type of action. And I think that also the story is something that feels very Star Wars-esque, but in my opinion, it's better than Star Wars. I know it's a hot take, but this film just has it all. It has all the elements of like romance, action, martial arts, and the martial arts action is some of my favorite. Love this film, and again, if you want a different kind of action, highly recommend this film. Next up, we have a film that unfortunately has one of the worst 4K transfers, but it is what it is. The film itself is still great. And we have Terminator 2, Judgment Day. Love this film. I think this is a great film, and it's one of the rare instances, although on this list specifically it happens to be sequels that are better than its predecessors, but Terminator 2 is one of the rare instances of a sequel being better than its predecessor. And bar none. Like, I think the first Terminator is good, but I haven't watched it since I first saw it back in 2014. Terminator 2, I do come back to every couple of years because I do think it's incredible. I love the action sequences. I love the car chases. The gunfire of this film is amazing. I really do love the gun battles itself. Just a lot to really appreciate about this film. James Cameron's action in this is amazing. I think that really, really good film. I would highly recommend it if you've been sleeping on this film. Even if you don't like action films, which I don't know why you'd click on this video if you don't like action films, but even if you don't like action, my wife doesn't like action, but she actually really dug this film. So that should tell you a lot. This film has a lot of emotional staying power, and I think that's what also makes the action all the more visceral and intense, and it's a really, really good film. And my last honorable mention, the one that was so close to make my top 10, like this close, we have Old Boy, 2003. So this is a revenge action film, and I know what you're probably thinking. Wait a minute, there's not that much action. And that's something that I probably should have prefaced earlier, is that some of these action films that I have on this list might not necessarily have nonstop action, but when they have action, they are impactful. And I feel like Old Boy took a old school approach, if you will, to that, where when there is action, it sticks with you. Specifically, the famous quarter action scene, which is all in one take, and it is amazing. The choreography of that sequence is just one of those things where while you're watching a wide-angle shot of people fighting, you just can't help but appreciate the choreography, the score, the cinematography, all these elements coming together to really make for an impactful action scene. And of course, there's other action scenes that are really good, but that's the standout one, and that's the one where I'm like, yeah, that's one of the best action scenes I've ever seen. This is also one of the films where it also happens to have an incredible twist. So if you've been sleeping on Old Boy for some reason, I would highly recommend it. And even worse so, I would highly recommend picking up this 4K edition because it's pretty awesome. But yeah, Old Boy, so close to making my top 10 list. But alas, it was my last honorable mention.
At number 10, I'll be going with Speed, a movie that I've always really loved. 30 years later, it still stands the test of time. The visual effects, the tension, the stakes, the conflicts on this bus, and best of all, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock and their chemistry. The characters are all really great. This is such an exciting movie, and there's never a bad time to revisit it, in my opinion. Number 9 is Mad Max Fury Road, one of the most beautiful films possibly ever in this action genre we're talking about. It's, the color correction and the world building is so perfect. I feel like you don't even need to watch any of the other Mad Maxes before to understand what's going on and who this person is, and the use of Furiosa, who's one of the best female action heroes of all time now. It's immersive, it's exciting, it's perfectly edited and written, and all the characters have their eccentricities, like Nicholas Hoult or the vicious Immortan Joe or Zoe Kravitz and Riley Keough and all those other characters. I just feel like it's incredibly rewatchable, but it has this feeling of relentless epicness, and the action is just so strong and visceral. Number 8 is Skyfall. I feel like Roger Deakins' cinematography alone elevates this from an excellent James Bond movie to an action masterpiece. And Javier Bardem is so effective as the villain Silva because he's sort of like a James Bond if he couldn't take his government's betrayals any longer. And so there's so many parallels being drawn between Bond and the villain, and I really love that. And also Thomas Newman, the composer, just never misses. At number 7 is The Dark Knight. I mean, we were talking about villains just now. Do we have to talk about why Heath Ledger is so brilliant? Or do you already know why he's like a masterful Joker? The crime atmosphere it presents, the moral dilemmas, the action, the pacing, it's just all perfect. I have no notes for this movie. It's not only one of the best superhero movies of all time, but one of the best action movies ever made. Number 6 is Baby Driver, a movie I can watch like anytime. I could just like pop it in and enjoy it again. This is a movie that when I watched it in theaters, I was just in awe. When I rewatched it, I was in awe. When I watched it again for the 3rd time, I was still like, wow, how did they do this? It is such a fun movie. The music, the characters, the dialogue. It's my favorite Edgar Wright movie. It's got tons of great needle drops and action scenes done to the music. I think that's why it's one of my favorite action scenes too, is because of the editing of the fights and the guns and the cars and so on. That's been my 10 through 6. Back to you, Chad.
So to kick off my top 10, we have The French Connection. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Wait a minute, an action film? Yeah, it's actually categorized as an action film, and it happens to be one of my favorite films of all time. Now, here's the thing. I did actually recently have a movie night for this film, and most of my friends either fell asleep or were bored out of their mind by this film, and that's simply because I mentioned in my honorable mentions how some of the films that are on this list have it where there's not that much action, but when it happens, it's very impactful. And The French Connection takes an old school approach to this, similar to something like Old Boy, where there is a slow build-up to French Connection, and once there is actually action, it's one of those things where it really leaves you with a intense, visceral feeling to it, especially the car chase. The car chase in this film is probably my favorite car chase, or definitely up there, I should say. I love this film. I think that when the action does occur, it's pretty incredible, and I think that the combination of action, police procedural, and crime really make for an impactful experience, and I do think that this is one of those films that really had an impact on the action genre, similar to something like Bullet, but I like The French Connection more. Now, I know some of you might say, oh, To Live and Die in LA is better, and I can respect that. I do really like that film, but I think The French Connection is better for me personally, but love this film, and that's why I have it as my number 10. Next up, my number 9, this is the granddaddy of shootout scenes in terms of American cinema, at least, and that is Heat. Yeah, it has one of, if not the best, shootout scenes. That shootout scene that happens, I think it's around the 2-hour mark. It's incredible, especially with like a surround system and on the 75-inch TV. It's pretty awesome. One of those films that also just really stapled itself in regards to the action genre. Like I mentioned The French Connection earlier, how that had a huge impact on the action genre. Heat did as well, not only for the shootout scene, but also how they mixed all the gun sounds. That was something that was very impactful. And then also having it where there was so much emphasis on the character interactions. Like at the end of the day, Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, you could watch a whole film that's focused just specifically on the diner scene, but those scenes are enriching because when there is action that also happens, it makes those scenes of the calm before the storm all the more impactful. So I love Heat. I think it's a great action film. And again, even if you don't necessarily like action films, it's one that I think you'll appreciate because it did a lot for the genre. It's inspired many different action films, and some of them might also be on this list. That's my number 9. Next up, my number 8, we have Gladiator. So Gladiator is a film, I've heard some people criticize the action scenes, specifically the frame rate. There are a lot of times where the frame rate drops, and I can understand why some people might not necessarily like those choices. I do, personally, because I think that it really gets in the mindset of like Maximus with what he's feeling during these sequences. Like, it's one of those things where it doesn't feel random. In my opinion, it feels very much so intentional, and I personally think that it worked quite a bit. But the action scenes also, the scale of them are just something that is amazing. I really do like the scale, and I think that even though there are some epic battles, I also think that the sequences that actually happen in the Colosseum, like in the ring, are something that also are just as impactful. Just a film that's overall very well put together, that's filled with action scenes that are incredible, and very much so memorable, especially that opening scene, that opening battle scene. It's incredible. So I love Gladiator. I'm filming this on November 9th of 2024. So I haven't seen Gladiator 2 just yet. So I'm very curious to see what the sequel is going to do. But as it stands, Gladiator, I think it's an incredible action film. And that's why I have it as my number 8. Next up, my number 7, we have another film that is action on a large scale. Much larger, though, than Gladiator, which is saying something, because Gladiator does have big battles that are quite epic. But we have Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. So I could have chosen any of these three, but I think specifically Return of the King, the Battle of Pelennor Fields, is one of those things where my jaw drops every single time that I see that scene. It is incredible with what Peter Jackson was able to accomplish with this film, especially during that sequence. And that's not the only action scene to occur. There is action that happens throughout, and it is very intense. It's very well choreographed, and you really feel for these characters. And that's one of the big things, too, with action films, is that you want to care about the action, and that helps when you have characters to care about. And Lord of the Rings Return of the King, that's definitely the case, especially because it's the final entry in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So there is high-stakes action that's occurring, and it's very, very intense, and it's very, very much so one of those things where, in terms of fantasy action, it's probably the best fantasy action you'll ever see. So I love this film, and that's why I have it as my number 7. Next up, my number 6. This is the film that had a huge, and I mean huge, impact on my life in terms of being a film critic, film buff, and that is my number 6, which is Skyfall. So I mentioned The Bourne Ultimatum in my honorable mentions, and those were that trilogy was something that I grew up watching in terms of action films. I grew up with that. I grew up with the Transformer movies. So it's one of those things where I was so used to shaky camera work, and I was so used to that's how the norm is, that's how it's filmed, to the point where I saw Taken 2 earlier in 2012. Like, when I say earlier, I mean like a month before I saw Skyfall. And Taken 2 and Skyfall, they both have the same action set piece. And I enjoyed Taken 2. I saw it twice in theaters, which I know saying this 12 years later is one of those things where it's like, that's not something you should say. But that's how it was. 12 years ago, I saw it twice in theaters. But I then saw Skyfall in November of 2012, and seeing that film, my jaw dropped, because I was like, wow, like, so you can make an action film where it's very much so clean. The action is clean. The camera's just slowly following the characters doing action. You have a lot of wide angle shots, so you're actually able to see, the impact of the punches. You're able to see the gunfire. It's not like quick cut editing. It was just such a breath of fresh air, especially because, as I mentioned, in October of 2012, I saw Taken 2, where it was quick cut editing, and at the same set piece. So it was one of those things where it really changed my perspective on action films and how you can film action set pieces on a very clean way. And I think that that's what Skyfall did very well. Sure, you could make the argument that this film is pretty much The Dark Knight, but in Britain. And I would say, yeah, I mean, Dark Knight's an incredible film. So I love Skyfall. I think the action scenes are great. I love car chases, especially motorcycle chases. And this film has an opening scene that combines the two, and it's really good. I also think that the way that this film is shot, as I mentioned, not only just the way how it's very cleanly shot, but also just the colors, the lighting, the shadows, everything about it is just perfect. And I think that the fact that this film is PG-13 but feels so visceral is a testament to the filmmaking on hand. I love Skyfall. It's one of my favorite action films of all time. That's why it was my number 6.
Now it's time for my 5 through 1, the top 5 action movies in my opinion. Number 5 is Aliens, directed by James Cameron. I love this one even more than the first because I think it ups the stakes. It even got Sigourney Weaver an Oscar nomination, well deservedly, for playing Ellen Ripley, one of the most iconic characters in action movie history. It's got terrific world building. I love the relationship between Ripley and Newt, not to mention the xenomorphs are even more terrifying. It's even even more thrilling to look at. The final act is so iconic. In my opinion, it's a step up in every way. Number 4 is Kill Bill Volume 1. I know some people consider Kill Bill to be one movie, two movies, whatever, but if I had to pick one of the two, I love them both, but Volume 1 is so perfect. The visuals, the editing, the action scenes, especially that famous crazy 88 action scene. Wow. All the characters and motivations and the soundtrack. Like the soundtrack to Kill Bill Volume 1, one of the all-time greats. Number 3 is Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I really debated if I wanted to put Raiders or Last Crusade on here because they're almost equally good in my opinion, but I think Raiders is, the first one, the most iconic, and the one I've seen the most times. It brought us one of the most iconic action heroes in history. We have so many great scenes like the boulder scene, or the fight with the plane, or the sword and the gun, which we have a great behind the scenes story about. I don't know what else to say because I feel like it's such a talked about movie for good reason, but 40 plus years later, I feel like we can still revisit Raiders all the time and just talk about how well the action and characters and music, of course, by the amazing John Williams, hold up so well. Number 2 is The Matrix. Now we're talking about how well these movies hold up. Does Keanu's acting as Neo always hold up? But the rest of the movie? Absolutely. And Keanu as an action hero, absolutely as well. Whether it's the amazing groundbreaking visuals like the bullet time scene or the crazy shots and angles, I feel like The Matrix and its world building, its philosophies, its stakes, its badass characters and villain played by Hugo Weaving are all so irresistible still. I don't love the sequels, but the first one is definitely one that I deeply enjoy and revisit it a bunch and just enjoy how outlandish and wild and just fascinating, and I genuinely, every time I see those action scenes, I'm like, yeah, tell me this isn't some of the best fighting ever put to screen. And number 1 for me is Terminator 2 Judgment Day. That's right, another James Cameron movie. I love this movie so much. There's funny moments, there's great practical effects, cool CGI, Robert Patrick is the villain, Schwarzenegger being the hero this time, Linda Hamilton coming in and matching Schwarzenegger's badassery from a script perspective, from an action scene perspective, and the action scenes are bloody and long and crazy. It just all holds up and shows you what can be done with a great concept and a great budget. And how many great quotes are there? Like, come with me if you want to live, or hasta la vista, baby. This will always be one of my favorite movies ever, period. Not just action movies. Anyway, this has been loads of fun. Thanks, Chad, for letting me hop on and talk about some great action movies. Back to you, my friend.
Now we get into the nitty gritty. Top 5. So, kicking things off with my top 5. My number 5, we have The Fugitive. Oh, The Fugitive's amazing. I remember when I first saw this film as a teenager, I saw it twice in the span of a couple of days. And I've seen this film periodically throughout my life since. It's incredible. It's one of those films that I can put on at any point in time and just say, yeah, this is incredible. There's not a single thing I would change about this film. The action is incredible. I think that the combination of action and adventure in particular is just stellar. The famous train scene, that's all I'm going to say, that scene is incredible. The choreography of that is just like perfection. And I also just love the fact that people are chasing each other. It's a lot of running, but the score by James Newton Howard is something that's very upbeat, and at the same time, the way it's paced is breakneck. One of those films, again, I wouldn't change a single thing, and I think that the action in this film is incredible, and I think that the story, the characters, all come together to create one of the best action films of all time, in my opinion. Love this film. Next up, my number 4. I mentioned this a little bit earlier because I had the prequel on this list. And my number 4, we have Mad Max Fury Road. Yeah, I love this film. I saw it 4 times in theaters, and I've seen it probably at this point like a dozen times or so, I would say. And what can I say? I love this film. I think that it is incredible how this film is... It is more so about how the story is through the world building. Through the world building, we get to know the characters, we get to know the situations, and it's something that I really appreciate. There is an emphasis on visual storytelling that many action films just do without. There is a lot of times in action films where there's a lot of exposition, quick cut editing, but in this film, I will say, I just mentioned quick cut editing. This film does have some instances of quick cut editing, but because the center of the screen is where all the action happens, it makes it so that way it never feels like you don't know what's going on. You, at all times, know what's going on because the characters are put in the center of the action. And that's what makes for a very visceral experience. I love this film. It's one of those things where, again, there's not really time to breathe, but you still nonetheless care about everything that's going on thanks to the world building and the character development. Just a very well put together film with incredible action. It's not only one of the best action films of the 2010s, but of all time, in my opinion. And I do think that at some point, relatively soon, I'll try to watch Furiosa Mad Max Saga, and then right after I'll rewatch Mad Max Fury Road, because I feel like that would be an incredible pairing. But love this film. That's my number 4. Next up, my number 3. This is another film that I mentioned earlier because he really influenced this film. My number 3, we have The Dark Knight. What can I say? This film I think I've seen like 24 times. I mentioned earlier how I love action scenes specifically that have like motorcycles and other other vehicles. And this film has an incredible instance where this film combines both regular vehicles, Batmobile, motorcycle. It's just one of those things where I fell in love with this film, like through the action scenes. I also think that the handheld choreography is something that's really good. And again, it's a PG-13 action film, but it feels very much so that it's not PG-13 because of just how intense everything is, how high octane it all is. Again, the emotional stakes for this film are very high, and I do think that this film never peaks. It has action throughout that makes it so that way we as viewers are like really engaged with this film. The way I would look at it as this is one of those films that really changed the action genre forever and also the superhero genre. So one of those films that, again, because of its impact alone, I have to respect it, but also the entertainment value and just the overall action in it is why I have it so high on this list too. Love this film. That's my number 3. Next up, my number 2, this is a film that also changed the action genre forever, and also just cinema in general. My number 2, we have Raiders of the Lost Ark. Yep, the one that brought Indiana Jones onto the big screen. There has yet to be an Indiana Jones film, or really any PG film, that's been able to match it in regards to its sheer scale, its sheer ambition. Just a film that has incredible action choreography. Like, this is one of those instances that's similar to like The Dark Knight. I'll watch it and I'll be like, oh yeah, this is a great scene. And then it's like another scene will happen. It's like, oh yeah, this is a great scene. Like, I love this scene. I can't wait for this to happen. Or, oh, I can't wait for this scene. Like, it's one of those things where there is constantly things happening that somehow one up the other thing that occurs. Like, it's one of those films that's similar to The Dark Knight. The action never peaks. If anything, it gets better and better as it progresses. So I love Raiders of the Lost Ark. I think it's a masterpiece of the genre and just a film that if you've been sleeping on, if you somehow haven't seen this film, I would highly recommend watching it. It's one of the best of the genre, and that's why it is my number 2. Next up, my number 1. If you've been following this channel, this is a film that it's not going to surprise you. It's not at all. But if you haven't yet followed my channel, it might. My number 1, we have The Raid 2. So I liked The Raid, the first one. I thought it was good, but similar to Terminator, I haven't seen Terminator, the first one, since 2014, and the first Raid film I think I saw in 2014, but I haven't seen since. The Raid 2, on the other hand, I've seen like 12 times. I love it. I actually recently showed one of my friends this film, and it's the same reaction every single time. Like, there is not a single film that can beat this film in regards to the action choreography. It is amazing. And also just the wide variety of action is also outstanding. Like, yeah, there's car chases. One in particular, I should say. There's one. But there's also a lot of handheld action. There's a lot of gun action. There's baseball action. Yeah, there's baseball bat action. So it's one of those things where there's just a wide variety, and I just think it's really incredible. And I think that it's also incredible because it works as a crime film. Like, this is almost like The Godfather Part 2 meets like The Departed, but with a lot of action that's hard to watch. It's incredible. It really is. If you've been sleeping on this film, I would highly recommend watching it. You don't necessarily have to watch the first one, although, again, the first one is quite good. But the second one is just, it's so worth your time if you haven't watched it yet, but love action. Highly recommend this film. And that's why it was my number 1. But hey guys, that's my list. I mentioned how you guys can follow me on Letterboxd to see all the action films that I've seen. I know some of you might be like at this point, wait a minute, Mission Impossible Fallout, or the John Wick films, or Speed, or trying to think of some of the other ones. Die Hard. Those are all films I quite like. I actually own them. You probably can't see up top, but I own all 4 John Wicks. I own Mission Impossible Fallout. I own Die Hard. I own Speed. I like them all. But these are the films that, in terms of the action genre, I like more. But, yeah. I'm curious to see your list, guys. Again, please let me know yours in the comment section down below. And again, be sure to subscribe to get all of Film Toppings down below. And as always, I appreciate you guys watching. And don't forget the subscription, notification bell, follow me down on Patreon, Letterboxd, and I'll catch you guys later.